So, hello everybody. Welcome to This Is Good. This is a sort of unofficial tradition at the New York Times, started about 8 years ago, where we choose an article from outside the Times to read, discuss something that caught our eye that we think is really good and maybe we're deeply envious of. I'm joined this week by my colleagues Azam Ahmed, Sarah Lyall, Vanessa Friedman, and two special guests. We have Carl Hulse, our Chief Washington correspondent. Carl's real claim to fame, most people don't even know this. He's responsible for breaking one of the biggest sports stories in recent history, the New England Patriots spying scandal. Carl got the scoop on that. His name wasn't on our story, but you should buy him a drink sometime in DC and ask him to tell you the backstory on Spygate. I'm also pleased to welcome actor Bradley Whitford, who is perhaps best known for his role as the Chief of Staff, John Lyman, in The West Wing, and more recently, his role as Commander in The Handmaid's Tale. Bradley's also a Times subscriber. We're excited he joined us today. Bradley, welcome. And for everybody tuning in, today's article that we're discussing is from The Atlantic by Anne Applebaum. It's titled, "History Will Judge the Complicit," about how Republican leaders can reconcile their personal principles with their support of the current president. This piece was chosen by Sarah Lyall. Sarah, why don't you get us started? Tell us why you picked it. Anything else? You're on mute, Sarah.
Now I'm unmuted.
There you go.
Sorry about that. Anne is a terrific historian and someone who's able to marry her understanding of history with a really good journalism style where she explains things fully and really clearly. She's an expert in Eastern Europe and Soviet history. She wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book called The Gulag a few years ago. And I really like it when she applies her sense of history to today's moment. I think that's one thing we've all had a hard time doing, is putting what's happening in our country right now in historical perspective. It's an unprecedented time. So in this piece, she looks at the decisions that people in the Soviet era, the post-Soviet, the post-World War II era had to face in Eastern Europe, she starts off with, and the decision to either go along with what the regime was doing that was counter to what their own ideology and philosophy said, or to become dissidents and go up against it. And she starts off by looking at two different people who took different ways, different approaches to it. One is Wolfgang Leonhardt, who taught me history at Yale. And so it's sort of exciting to get to hear his backstory here. And it's a very complicated piece, but it's incredibly well told. And then she starts to apply some of these things to the issues facing the Republican Party today. And she's not saying, as she points out, that Trump is like Hitler or he's like Stalin, but it's more how people who have stated ideology have to suddenly start making compromises that seems to contradict what they themselves have always said and believed, and how we look at what's happening in the Republican Party today in view of that.
And obviously this piece has many, many virtues, and we're gonna talk through many of them today. But what stood out to me, one of the things was that how good of a writer Anne is. I mean, we in our business wrestle with the nut graph, right? That like paragraph or two toward the top of the story that most crystallizes, distills a really complicated thing. She had these like throughout her piece, like every other paragraph was just like this very, very crystal clear distillation of something that was otherwise too complicated. And I went through and highlighted a bunch, but for Vanessa, Sarah, Azam, Carl, the writers in the house right now, I wonder if you guys were struck by that too.
Yeah, I was super impressed. I remember reading it thinking like, what a treat to have the scope of a historian with the hand of a journalist. Because as Sarah mentioned, so many times you read something and it's either turgid and dense, but very profoundly contextualized, or it's somewhat facile and doesn't have the context if it's a journalistic piece, or it can't go into that history. And I also appreciated how long she took with the opening section to really set up the dynamic between these two men, and to get in the sort of headspace of like what she was talking about. It was, in a newspaper story that would have been really hard. Nobody would have let you go on for that long in that kind of depth. But But yeah, the writing in particular, I think, made it so much easier to consume and so much more effective.
Mm-hmm. And we brought Carl in particularly because if anybody understands the psyche of congressmen, it's Carl Hulse. So Carl, talk to us about what you thought of this thing.
I guess I'm sort of the Republican whisperer in this group. You know, as soon as it came out, I read it way before you even contacted me about this, because, you know, this is my job, basically, to sort of interpret and analyze what's going on with these folks. And I read it immediately. I'm also a giant World War II history buff and a history person, and was really caught up with it. I mean, she can really write, no doubt about that, because it's a long story, but it doesn't feel long when you're reading it, which is probably the greatest compliment that I can pay. But I will tell you guys this: the number one question that I've gotten from New York editors over the last 3x years has been, when are the Senate Republicans going to split from Donald Trump? When is that going to happen? And they've just, I've tried to explain to them, and we can talk more about this, why that won't happen and why that really is not in the cards for most of the time. And I think people have had a hard time understanding it. And so for her to try and get in there and analyze it from this historical perspective, I thought was really helpful. I was very impressed with the story. I read it, as I said, as soon as it came out, and I think I've read it twice since then, and I'm still sort of trying to figure out exactly what it says.
Yeah, I was really interested in the point she made about how insidious, you know, becoming complicit can be. That it starts with these tiny little compromises that really seem like nothing too dramatic, and you know, you just go sliding down that slope. And I think that, you know, painting that portrait with just those little dots and the facts, and the way she was able to, you know, draw in experiences from all sorts of different historical moments, not just Eastern Europe and Nazi and communist Germany, you know, but South America and other regimes, was really effective and helpful, actually, you know, in understanding what's going on now.
Bradley, you want to jump in? You might, I think you're muted.
Story of my life. I thought this was just beautifully written, and it was reassuring and disturbing, the sort of mastery of the historical context of this. One of the things that struck me was the effectiveness of the first idiotic lie about the size of the crowd at the inauguration, and how, even though we know it's not true, it starts to sort of tenderize us and make us more vulnerable. I always joke, I was doing a showbiz interview with a journalist recently, and we were talking about Trump, and I was thinking, like, imagine if I said to her, "Are you recording? Good. Okay, here's the first thing you need to know about me. I am phenomenally rich. And the reason I am so rich is I'm the greatest actor who's ever lived. I don't know if you've seen my work in Revenge of the Nerds 2, Nerds in Paradise, but I'm a genius." If I said that...
Azam uses that line all the time.
It doesn't work for me.
But if I said that, my stupid, inconsequential show business career would justifiably be over. And there's something so disorienting about this guy from the beginning. I also think that underneath all of this, I just feel like Republicans are very pragmatic. They want their business interests taken care of. They want the judicial nominees. And if they can weaponize this sort of insanity to achieve those goals, they're fine with it.
Yeah, let me talk, just to build on that a little bit. So February 2017, chaos is reigning in the country. The ban, the travel ban has gone into effect. Washington is freaking out. I go to Senator Mitch McConnell's office to interview him for a piece, and I literally said to him, I said, well, Senator, I'm in his inner office there, and I said, people are counting on you to save the world. Are you going to step forward and save the world right now? And he says to me, he goes, save the world? We don't think the world needs saving. We were worried that Trump was going to be a Democrat. He's actually governing right now, kind of like we would have thought Marco Rubio or another nominee would have. I wrote this in the paper, you can dig up the story. He was perfectly fine with this. And I think this is what people miss in all this. You know, we all see the Republicans and Trump, and we see Trump and what's going on in one way, and the Republicans see it in a totally different way. And, you know, to a great extent, they don't like, honestly, the personality and things that go on, but they like the policy. They're generally okay with it. They don't like the chaos so much, but they really don't like Democrats. And, you know, if their option is to be Trump or Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer, that's no option for them. So if that's my insight to how they approach this.
But Carl, can you speak more specifically to the Lindsey Graham phenomenon? I mean, I think
that is a sort of a different story. I mean, I've known Lindsey Graham since he was in the House as an impeachment manager, and I wrote a book recently, Confirmation Bias, about the judicial fight.
Do you have that book handy?
New in paperback.
Here it is. And do they sell it anywhere? Like
I think Amazon might.
Amazon does carry it. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
But anyway, but I don't think there's no one would dispute that Lindsey Graham, and I don't want to be psychoanalyzing Lindsey Graham, but I'm going to psychoanalyze him anyway, and he probably won't mind. Lindsey Graham was terribly affected by the death of John McCain, his best friend, his mentor, you know, his guiding light, who hated Trump. And I think if you talk to Lindsey Graham's folks, so I'm seeing on the chat that some people want to know what the gist of the story is, and it's like how Republicans have become complicit with Trump. And I think Lindsey Graham, you know, was searching for a little bit for a way to, remain a force in the Senate to get reelected in his very conservative state, and which is going on right now. And he's decided to side with Trump. But he, again, go back what I said earlier, you know, he finds the Democrats very hard to take. And he doesn't want any part of that. However, as you saw, I mean, just in the past few days, Lindsey Graham has stuck up for Tony Fauci and kind of broken with the administration a little on that. So there's little breaks here and there, but there's no big breaks. And I think Lindsey Graham was a little rootless after John McCain died.
So as a creature of Washington, how long have you been reporting down there?
35 years.
35 years. So this piece makes the case that any number of Republicans have swallowed their principles and hitched their wagon to somebody who does not espouse the same political beliefs that they do.
But a lot of the beliefs are the same.
I'm just wondering why. Is that, if we say for the sake of discussion that is happening, does that surprise you? Is this totally commonplace in Washington and this happens with every administration, or has it been more acute?
I think it's probably been more acute because Trump is such a radical departure from what we've had in presidents in the past, you know, and I think it's a little different, but I do think, you know, the main goal of people in Congress these days, and it's unfortunate, is to get reelected. And you generally make the decisions that you would make to help you that way. When you look at Jeff Flake, of course, who's mentioned in the story, he made decisions and got in a position where he couldn't be reelected. And that's what Republicans fear about Trump. And we're seeing that play out now.
I had a fascinating conversation with a Republican congressman it was in early 2016. And it was somebody who wanted to get involved in climate solutions, but was worried about being primaried out. And I remember asking them, saying, so what basically, yeah, and what they were saying was, if I do this, I'll get primaried immediately if I start working on this issue. And I said, so basically then your elections are bad for democracy. And this congressman said, yes, absolutely. They're terrible. We can't get
Or bad for them anyway.
Yeah.
And you did. Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say, I think just what a lot of people, and I'd love to ask Carl about this, it's not just the being complicit in policies or whatever, it's the disconnect between what some of these people said before and what they're saying now. So some of the other candidates for the nomination who Trump was incredibly rude about their wives and said horrible stuff. And they said at the time, you know, and Kellyanne Conway said at the time, this person is the worst person who ever lived and this would be terrible for democracy. And the disconnect between that and them now forgetting they said it or whatever. The question is sort of, is that normal politics or is this really an extraordinary time? And I think what Anne is trying to say in this piece is that this is beyond normal politics. She's saying that some of the things that Trump has done are actually redolent of these totalitarian regimes where, you know, you're boiled a little bit in the water as a frog until finally you're in some other kind of country than the one you started out. And so that's really the question for those people is, do they see it as just a little bit more than normal, or do any of them really feel like they've had to, you know, sell themselves out somehow? And how do they explain what they said before, which was so beyond what most people seem to say in an election, to what they're saying now?
I mean, I'll take a crack at that. I mean, I do think, and Vanessa, I think, mentioned the insidiousness, you know, on the terms of, you know, Washington is the capital of hypocrisy, right? The things that people say 1 second, they can immediately say the opposite of it. And I think what you see, let's just think about the Senate and the judges for a minute, right? As soon as the majority changes, the people who were once complaining about what was going on are now the ones doing it. So in some ways, I think it's both normal and remarkable. Things flip around in Washington all the time, but this is a new level. We see things every day that we have never seen before. And, you know, when you think of Ted Cruz, is what I think what you're talking about is, you know, what Trump said. Ted Cruz, didn't he say that Trump said that his father was involved in killing JFK? And he ridiculed his wife, and Ted Cruz is all on the Trump train these days. Now, they tend to ignore it, but they can't because we remind them constantly on Twitter. I mean, anytime Ted Cruz says something on Twitter, there's about 1 million tweets about what he said about his wife. So I think that this is, it is remarkable. But my experience in Washington over the course of these 3 decades is that everything just slowly gets ratcheted up all the time. Everything just keeps getting a little more crazy. And I think we're just at a new level now, and people are dealing with it. But I do think that's what's helping Joe Biden too right now. I mean, people in Washington have you know, issues with Biden, and Joe Biden hasn't been a successful candidate in the past. But everybody just wants, not everybody, the people who are supporting Biden, and some of whom aren't that crazy about him on the left, they want some sort of return to normalcy. So anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't want to.
In 3 decades, what are some, if any, come to mind, some examples of, you know, you seeing politicians really turn away from what they seem to stand for?
Well, I think with Obama, I mean, the Republican Party, you know, there were a lot of people who wanted to work with Obama and who thought that potentially they could work with Obama, but, you know, they decided for their own reasons that it wouldn't be good politics and that they could do better by resisting Obama. And so nothing really got done after they lost control of the House. Just one last thing about this is that I remember showing up 2009, January 3rd, when Republicans we're looking at, almost 60 seats in the Senate for the Democrats. The Democrats had the House. They thought they were going to be out of power forever. And then, within 2 years, they managed to turn it around and took control of the House. And, but Washington's is a place where self-preservation is key. And I think you see that with the Republicans now.
Jason, I've got a question for you as an editor. I mean, I thought this was actually a pretty brave piece, because even though Anne says she's not comparing Trump to Hitler or Trump to Stalin, she is still effectively saying, you, the Republican Party, are acting like, the Germans during the Nazi regime and being, in supporting this guy. And that's a pretty extreme position to take, even if, it's the kind of thing everyone says to each other, while we're talking offline. If someone came to you as a writer and was like, I want to write this piece, or I want to do this piece for, New York Times Presents, what would your reaction have been?
Full disclosure, somebody did come to me with this piece.
It was Carl, right?
No, when Sarah picked it for this forum, Sarah, we should go back and look at the exchange, but I did dismiss it out of hand, and I said, oh, give me a break. Somebody comparing current events to the Nazis, like, no thanks.
I think you were just like, you don't want to read a piece out long because you're kind of lazy editor, basically.
It could be that too.
On a tear.
I've heard what Azam's editor has to deal with. I'm like, I'm not going there. No, so I sat down and read it, and I have to say that was like one of the winning moments for me. If I jotted down some notes, so bear with me for a second. But as Azam said, she had a great setup. It was incredibly accessible, and I found myself kind of going along for this ride. And then she got to the point where she said, okay, I'm just going to completely disarm you now. And she said very plainly, the point is not to compare Trump to Hitler or Stalin. The point is to compare the experiences of high-ranking members of the American Republican Party, especially those who work most closely with the White House, to the experiences of Frenchmen in 1940, East Germans 45, et cetera. These are the experiences of people who are forced to accept an alien ideology or set of values that are in sharp conflict with their own. And when I got to that graph, that was my sort of like, I'm in moment. Like I'm completely bought into this as a concept. But yeah, my initial allergy to the very connection of Trump administration, I was like, get out of here. But I was won over.
I think the distinction that this article makes beautifully clear, it would be deeply offensive to countless souls to compare Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler. But I can tell you, for the first time in my life, I understand how that could happen by what is happening today. And I think that's what this article captures. We're not saying it's the same thing, but we're showing how a civic virus can spread to the point where we are politicizing the CDC. Tens of thousands of human beings are dying. It looks pretty much unnecessarily. How do we get to this point where we've totally forgotten about the kids in the cages? It's not about comparing it to Hitler, but it really makes me understand how that happened, I guess.
The other thing about this piece that I found just shattering in some ways is a reminder of all the stuff that's happened. It was like going through it, I'm like, oh yeah, that happened. Oh yeah, that happened. Oh yeah, it was this like chronology of bankruptcy almost. And it's interesting with Carl, you have to keep on top of all these, like you said, there's something remarkable and once in a lifetime every week. And it's hard to get that bird's eye view of just how much things have shifted, because I've forgotten about, like the Muslim ban. I was like, oh yeah, that happened. They tried to do that. I think one of the reasons this piece worked for me as well is because she had so much information she could marshal to make her point.
Yeah.
And there is something, I'm sorry, quickly, unprecedented about this guy is about what Trump does. Whether I agreed with them politically or not, I feel like every president in my sort of adult life left office brokenhearted that they couldn't have united us more. I mean, whether it was Bush or whether it was Obama. We have a guy here who thrives on division. That's unprecedented recently.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to say when he leaves, I wish I could have united people more. I want to go back to what Vanessa said, because that was what caught me when, as soon as this story, I said, wow, this is really comparing the congressional Republicans to the collaborators in World War II. And, you know, I always have this picture of women with their heads shaved from the movies. And I thought, wow, this is really quite a point. Buried down in that story, there is that line that says, this is not meant to compare Trump and the Republicans to World War II. But it is. I mean, you know, we all, as reporters, we all know when you stick that line, this probably 40 graphs down into this piece, right? Okay, you got to say it. But I mean, I think she was making that comparison. And, you know, this is, and I think that was brave and worth exploring. So that really struck me.
So I wonder, just having read it, did it make you think differently about, like, you know, as a reporter on this, as an analyst of this, about what our, you know, responsibility is? I have thought
a lot about this and how to convey it in writing, and, you know, the balance between, you know, writing stuff that we have on the record and knowing other things. I think it was very, very thought-provoking to me. I'm definitely not there yet in terms of that comparison, but I mean, I think that the party is going to be judged on this. There's long-term consequences here for the Republican Party. And, you know, there's long-term consequences for the Democratic Party for some things that are going on now too. But when you see the changing demographics of this country, the politics, the polling right now, you know, Republicans seem to me to be in real danger. And, you know, later on they might say, well, you know, we weren't all, you're going to see probably, obviously, rewriting of history. We weren't all on board for all this, but, you know, there's plenty of documentation here. I think that the Republican Party is in a danger zone. And, you know, going forward, we'll have to see. I've been telling people, I said, if you see Mitch McConnell desert Donald Trump in the next few months, you'll know that Trump is definitely not going to win the election. That will be that'll be your takeaway at that moment.
Carl, if you were to go back to, say, 2016, early 2017, and somebody said that Romney would turn against Trump and Graham would turn into Trump, yeah, would you have believed that?
Yeah, that is a tough one to imagine, because of the people, honestly, Lindsey Graham, who's a big focus of this story, and I think very interestingly, he is, because of Trump, the way Trump was with McCain, you would have thought that Lindsey Graham would be somebody who would fight Trump all the way. You know, but think back to the day, I'm sure you can all do this, when Trump first attacked John McCain and said he preferred his war heroes who weren't captured and shot down. Everybody thought that day that was the end of Trump. There were stories written up, there goes Trump's campaign, he's done, you can't do that. As it turned out, there were a lot of Republicans, of course, who didn't like John McCain and were happy with that comment. So, you know, we have to be careful too in making assessments on, you know, what people think and where they stand with Trump. And I think that was a problem in 2016. We miscalculated.
Sarah, did I cut you off? You were going to say something.
Well, I was just going to say it's part of what's been so interesting, and I think the comparison comes out when you read this piece between then and now, is the notion of everyone having faith in their system of government to be a bulwark against extremism and against non-democratic things. And that was always the issue when you study Nazi Germany. And the rise of Nazi Germany is how the civil society was in a way complicit with the rise of Hitler, because it refused to consider that someone like that could actually emerge as a democratically elected leader. And that's always been the issue, I think, with covering some of the stuff that Trump does. You know, the notion that of the disinformation that's such a tool used by authoritarian leaders of, you know, this happened, but I'm just going to say this other thing happened. And she has a bunch of examples of that. And of course, with Trump, it started off with the inauguration. And, you know, at what point do you say, actually, this is totally unacceptable and this person isn't operating within the norms of normal democracy as we see it? And that's the big tension right now, I think. And I think it's interesting to talk to Carl, because of course, Carl's there talking to a bunch of senators who can rationalize their way out of these questions and just say, oh, well, I don't like the way he behaves, but I really like the judicial appointments. And, you know, where do we sort of draw the line and just say, this is beyond the norms, this is unacceptable. And if you don't say that it's unacceptable, there's something seriously wrong with you as well.
Yeah, I thought that the point Anne made about dissent, and like the question really should be like, what makes a dissenter as much as what makes someone who's complicit, was really sort of an interesting thing to explore. And, you know,
yeah, the Eastern German lady who said,
yeah.
It's boring to talk about complicity. What's interesting is to talk about who is dissenting.
Yeah, and that, you know, maybe is something that like we don't think enough about too.
Yeah.
Talk to Jeff Flake.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe there's no benefit to it, right? I mean, I used to think there were certain political repercussions for things, but there just aren't. There have been a dozen things that Trump has done that if any other president, had done, any other senator had done, they'd be out of office. They'd be instantaneously. I mean, someone just used the grab them by the pee reference in the chat, and everybody was like, "Oh man, it's over." Nope. I mean, like somebody was like, "Well, in Mexico, people are fascinated by this. They're like, how can he? You know, how is he in power?" Ironically, they have a president quite similar to him, but I've been like, I can't forecast anything. I have literally no idea what is and is not acceptable to the body politic, because all those rules have been thrown out the window. It's interesting, like Carl, in Washington, do you get the sense that this is more outrageous perhaps, but like, is there that dissonance in the people you're talking to with these Republican senators, congressmen, who are like, yeah, I know it's crazy. I know that like, that's an unacceptable thing to say, don't care. Like in private, are they talking to you?
Yeah,
like that?
I mean, I do think the idea that Republicans totally revile Trump and trash him in private is overstated. You know, you hear from Republicans, they wish he wouldn't say this or whatever, but I do think that, and I think that they wish the commentary would go away, but you know, they still see, and I think Bradley mentioned this at the beginning, they still see gains to their party and things that they want to get done, the judges being a main one, taxes, and they don't embrace Democrats whatsoever. And I think, you know, the sort of rolling narrative in Washington has just done this exploding partisanship, and that means that nothing can really get done unless something has to be done immediately, and that's what's really been bad for the country and our democracy here.
I feel like his ability to disorient us cannot be overstated. I mean, I feel like the entire country is in kind of an Al-Anon situation. Like, Daddy is nuts. Daddy is nuts and hammered. I'm not saying Trump's hammered. Daddy is completely nuts. And Mommy, you know, the Republicans in Congress are saying, get in the van. And we're like, no, this is insane. It's really crazy making, which is part of his power over his own people and part of his ability to get stuff done, because he has us choking on a fire hose of moral depravity. You know, I think what the Republicans are doing is enabling lethal incompetence, and I think it's unforgivable. But I think there is an element of disorientation here. I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, don't you feel like this is sort of truth is stranger than fiction? If someone had presented you with a script when you're during the West Wing describing this situation, would you'd be like, no, I can't even say that. Like, there's no way.
Yeah, I've always said if there is a God, she's a shitty writer. I mean, if somebody walked into the West Wing writers' room and created, I always said the fakest thing about West Wing was we had rational Republicans. We would never, it would have been the most condescending, unrealistic thing in the world to create a character like Donald Trump, who a Republican who does nothing about Putin putting bounties on American soldiers. We would never do that. Nobody would have believed it, that it would have been tolerated.
I actually thought on that issue, I did think on the bounty issue that there would have been more blowback. And that was one that surprised me. There was some immediate pushback, but then Republicans did fall in line on that one. Even some of the people who had questioned it initially said, oh, it wasn't substantiated. That was one, because that was one that caught me by surprise. I thought we would have had more pushback. And it just shows you the hold that he does have on the party. Lisa Murkowski pushed back slightly when Mattis quit and made his statement recently. Trump immediately said he was going to campaign against her, and that's what it definitely serves to keep people in line, no doubt about it.
Carl, is there anything that he could do that would cause people to walk away from him? I mean, given all the mass amount of things he's
No!
I think that's the second most common question I get from New York editors. I guess maybe if he tried to stay in office after he lost, maybe, right. I don't know. I did think the bounty was going to be one there would be more, because say what you want, Republicans take their national security interests very seriously. People on the armed services committees, a lot of these are serious folks. And I was surprised because that story was obviously fact-based.
Yeah, for sure. I worked in Afghanistan, and I remember we all heard those rumors, especially the Iranians, but the fact that it came out indisputable and the Republicans didn't do anything, that surprised me a lot too. Because that's kind of a line, right? Like the foot soldier who gets hit by an IED or shot in crossfire. I didn't expect them to kind of roll over on that. I think one of the things that's been interesting for me working in Mexico, there's a new president here and is extremely charismatic, populist, a lot of the same kind of rhetoric and tactics that Trump has, very divisive, extraordinarily polarized. In seeing him and understanding him a little bit, it's actually kind of helped me understand Trump, like what's happening in the United States. And what I've been trying to do, it's so hard to find an honest broker here to talk to you about the president. So I went to the most rational, sort of thoughtful people. They're his longtime supporters. And I was just asking them, like, all the things that are happening, all the crazy stuff, why do you guys still support him? And they said, look, he has these long morning press conferences where he just fires off diatribes at everybody and sort of goes after the press and these insane sort of asides. Like when COVID came, he held up 2 amulets and said, those were what were going to protect him, just insane stuff. And I was like, why do you guys still support him? And they said, he's the best chance we have at fixing some of the more trenchant problems in this country. And from their perspective, it's kind of the opposite of what maybe a Republican would say, but it's social inequality. It's, an extraordinarily low minimum wage, et cetera. But I think I don't know, here at least, it's a total loss of faith in the system. And they think this guy, for all his ills, is the only guy who has the power and the will, and I guess is enough of a tough-elbowed guy to get it done.
Azam gets the last word. This is really great. So thank you guys. And
yeah, it was fun.
Good
to see everybody.
Thanks everybody for joining. We're back next month. Please stay on the lookout for all the information about that event. Tomorrow at 5 Eastern, you can join the Times Politics Desk for an event about the unconventional conventions, where they'll be joined by former Democratic presidential candidate Julian Castro. To RSVP for that one and to find out about all upcoming Times events, please visit timesevents.nytimes.com. Also, be sure to go back and watch some old West Wing episodes with Mr. Whitford as Josh Lyman. And go buy a book. Carl, what book should they buy?
Confirmation Bias.
All right.
It's a great explainer. Take care, you guys.
Bye, guys.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Bye.
See you later. Bye-bye.